They say memory fades, that the details of the past get lost like dust in old drawers, like photographs left too long in the sun. But sometimes something survives, something too strange to forget, something that slipped through the cracks of normal life and refuses to stay buried. I remember the first time I saw his face in the yearbook. It was a rainy Tuesday. The school library was mostly empty, silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of 1,000 thoughts bouncing quietly in 1,000 distracted teenage heads. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Just passing time, thumbing through old books, flipping through forgotten yearbooks like artifacts from another dimension. But then, page 67 stopped me cold. There he was, same eyes, same haircut, same crooked jawline and distant expression. A face I passed in the hallway almost every single day. He was standing next to a row of science teachers, labeled simply as custodial staff, Mr. Howard. But the yearbook was dated 1972. I checked the date twice. Triple-checked the name, looked back at the photo. Still him. He hadn't aged, not a wrinkle, not a single gray hair. 49 years had passed since that photo was taken, and he looked exactly the same as he did yesterday, pushing that same mop down the west hallway, silent, solitary, invisible. At first, I laughed to myself. Maybe it was a coincidence. A relative, maybe. A son, a grandson. Someone with strong genes and a stronger family resemblance. But the more I looked, the more the laughter drained out of me like warmth from the room. Because the expression in his eyes, that eerie calm, that bottomless stillness, was something no one else could mimic. It was the look of someone who had watched time pass like water through glass. I asked around. Teachers, staff, even the principal. Everyone gave me the same answer. Mr. Howard had always worked there. He's been here forever, they said, laughing, brushing it off. Probably came with the building. The more they joked, the less funny it became. I started watching him. Every morning, he arrived at 5:17 a.m. sharp. I know because I waited. Hidden behind the dumpster near the west parking lot, notebook in hand. Breath held like I was stalking something sacred or dangerous. And like clockwork, there he was, same uniform, same gait, same expressionless face. Never early, never late. Always exactly on time. He never parked. Never got dropped off. Never walked from the bus stop. He simply appeared. No one else seemed to notice. He never spoke unless spoken to. And even then, he answered in phrases so short they barely qualified as language. I once passed him in the hallway and said, "Morning, Mr. Howard." He looked at me, paused a moment too long, and replied, "Day 4, clean level, 94%. Then kept walking. It wasn't just eerie. It felt wrong, like he was reading from a script I wasn't supposed to hear. A week later, I followed him. It was before dawn, the sky still clinging to the last traces of starlight, and the campus drenched in silence. I watched from a safe distance as he entered the boiler room, a place students weren't supposed to go, a place most of us didn't even know still worked. I waited a moment, then crept in behind him, heart hammering like it knew something I didn't. Inside, the air was thick and humming, like something alive was breathing through the walls. I could hear faint pulses, mechanical and wet at the same time, like organic machines slowly waking up. Then I saw him. He stood in front of a section of wall, plain, metallic, unmarked. And then, without a word, he pressed his palm flat against it. The wall responded. It didn't open so much as fold, silently peeling back like layers of light and steel separating in perfect sync. Behind it was a chamber glowing with a soft blue pulse, full of panels and coils that didn't look like anything human-made. The hum deepened. I felt it in my teeth, behind my eyes. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. And then, he turned. He looked straight at me. His eyes were not eyes. They were mirrors of black, endless and unblinking, smooth as obsidian, deep as a starless sky. I froze. The hum stopped. Time did too. Then he spoke. Not with his mouth. with his mind. Curiosity will either save you or remove you. And just like that, the chamber closed. He walked past me as if I wasn't even there and vanished down the corridor. No questions, no threat. Just that one message planted deep inside my thoughts like a splinter I couldn't remove. I stood there, trembling, every part of me screaming to make sense of what had just happened. But the truth is, sense no longer applied. Logic had exited the room the moment the wall had opened, like a wound in the world. The next day, he was back, mopping the West Wing, nodding silently to passing students like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better now, and deep down, I think he knew I knew. Later that week, I returned to the library, this time with a mission. I asked the librarian for older archives, newspaper reels, photo logs, microfilm. Anything with images of the school from before my parents were even born. I dug through decades, 1960s, 1950s, even earlier. And he was always there. In 1951, a newspaper clipping read, "Custodian saves dozens from electrical fire," next to a grainy photo of the same man. Same face, holding a fire extinguisher. 1979, gas leak evacuation led by school maintenance worker. 1988, janitor honored for 30 years of service. Different events, same man, unchanged, untouched by time. That night, I found something in my locker, no note, no label. Just a small metal cube, smooth and cold, pulsing softly with a blue glow. When I picked it up, it felt like touching electricity. My fingers tingled, and then the voice returned. "Observe, remember, when they arrive, you'll know what to do." I looked around, expecting someone. Nothing, just the hallway, just lockers, just shadows. When I looked out the window, he was gone. Mr. Howard, the janitor who never aged, had vanished. But as I stared up at the clouds above the school, I saw something ripple through the sky, like a curtain being drawn back for just a second. A shimmer, almost invisible. Like something huge had just shifted behind the atmosphere. No one else saw it. No one else noticed anything strange. But I did. And from that day forward, I couldn't look at the world the same way again. Because somewhere beneath the surface of everyday life, behind the masks we wear and the routines we cling to, something else was watching. And some of them had already been here far longer than we ever imagined. In the days that followed Ethan's encounter with the janitor, something inside him refused to settle. The metallic hum he'd heard in the boiler room echoed faintly at the edge of every silence, like a memory chasing him down long hallways. He found himself walking slower, watching people closer, questioning the ordinary. The world hadn't changed, but he had. And then, without warning, came the arrival of Ms. Laura. She was introduced as the new biology teacher, but nothing about her felt new. She was composed yet unreadable, with eyes that lingered a fraction longer than they should, and a voice that never wavered. On her first day, she looked at each student with clinical precision, until her gaze fell on Ethan and stayed. She smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly, as though she already understood the outcome of a conversation that hadn't begun yet. That afternoon, during lab, she paused mid-lecture and said, "No one leave through the north stairwell today. There will be a spill." The class chuckled awkwardly until hours later. 2 freshmen were rushed to the nurse's office, coughing and soaked in formaldehyde. Ethan didn't laugh. He stared at her. She met his eyes with calm indifference and returned to grading papers. Later that week, she called him in after school under the guise of discussing a new advanced science track. Her office was sterile, dimly lit, and cold, not in temperature, but in design, like it hadn't been used by a human in years. She gestured to a chair without speaking, then handed him a small, sleek scanner. "Just a finger," she said softly. "It won't hurt." Against his instincts, Ethan complied. A single beep. A pause, and then she turned the screen toward him. "This," she said, "is not in any human database." The screen showed a swirling helix, unlike any DNA strand Ethan had seen in textbooks. There were additional codon sequences too perfect, too balanced. "What is it?" he asked. She leaned forward, folding her hands slowly, like a surgeon contemplating the first incision. "It's you," she replied. "Or rather, what you're becoming." Ethan blinked. "Becoming what?" Laura did not smile. "You were never meant to be just human," she said, voice low and absolute. "You were chosen to become." He stood abruptly. "This is a joke, right? Like some kind of test?" Laura shook her head, gently, like a parent watching a child deny the obvious. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I saw it 3 months ago. I always arrive before they wake." "They," she tilted her head. "You." Ethan stumbled backward, hand grazing a metal cabinet that hummed faintly, as if echoing the same vibration he once felt in the janitor's boiler room. "You're not a teacher," he whispered. "No," she admitted, "but I'm here to teach you something." He left in a rush, out into the crisp air of late autumn, heart pounding, lungs burning. But it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was the gnawing truth that deep down, part of him had known. The way dreams had started bleeding into daylight. The way he could suddenly understand fragments of languages on signs he'd never studied. The way people's intentions became clearer than their words. That night, he dreamt again. Not of school, not of Miss Laura, but of vast metallic halls submerged beneath oceans of shifting light, of voices without mouths, singing in harmonic pulses, of stars blinking in Morse-like sequences, as if calling him home. When he awoke, his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from recognition. Because Miss Laura hadn't lied. Something was awakening inside him. And it wasn't done yet. After the encounter with Miss Laura, and the unraveling truth that he may not be entirely human, Ethan began to see the world not through eyes of wonder, but through a lens tinged with suspicion and quiet dread. Each hallway seemed to hide a frequency just beyond hearing. Each human interaction now bore the scent of performance, as if roles were being played, not lived. But the final thread unraveled not at school, not in labs or dreams, but in the apartment complex where his best friend Leo lived, in a place no one truly noticed. Until it was far too late. Ethan had visited Leo's building countless times, always climbing the narrow stairwell to the 3rd floor, always passing the same rusty fire extinguisher, the same broken vending machine humming in disrepair. But it was apartment 4B that began gnawing at his mind like a whisper he couldn't shake. It sat across from Leo's unit, its door always closed, its lights always off. The manager said it had been vacant for years. Plumbing issues, foundation cracks, permits pending. And yet, every night around 2 a.m., a faint light would spill from the crack beneath its door. Not yellow, not warm, but pale and cold, like moonlight filtered through deep ocean water. One evening, while they were playing an old co-op shooter in Leo's dimly lit apartment, Ethan finally asked, offhandedly, "Hey, does anyone ever go in or out of 4B? Leo paused. His thumb hovered over the controller. He blinked slowly, as if the question required more processing than it should. Then, after a beat too long, he replied, "No, no one's ever lived there." He smiled too wide, too fast, and resumed playing. But something about his voice felt airbrushed, as if the syllables had been rehearsed. That night, Ethan stayed over. At 1:57 a.m., he slipped out of the guest room, padded quietly across the corridor, and pressed his ear against the chipped wood of apartment 4B's door. At first, there was silence. Then, a hum, low, vibrational, not a sound but a presence, like a frequency only nerves could interpret. And beneath that hum, whispers. Not words, not language, but the sensation of language being shaped. The doorknob turned. He leapt back just in time as the door cracked open. A sliver of that eerie light spilled out, licking the hallway floor like fog. And there, framed in the opening, stood Leo. But not his Leo. This Leo was smiling too much. His head tilted slightly, but his eyes didn't move. They locked onto Ethan's with such unblinking precision that it felt less like a gaze and more like a scan. "You okay?" he asked, voice smooth as glass, perfectly inflected, but lifeless. Ethan managed a nod, heart pounding in his chest. The door closed. When Ethan confronted Leo the next morning, he laughed it off. "You dreamt that, dude." Leo chuckled, flipping eggs on the stove. "I was passed out." But the moment he turned his back, Ethan noticed. Leo's left hand no longer bore the scar from the time they'd climbed a fence in 6th grade. The little nick that had once defined a summer memory, gone, replaced. Later that day, Ethan knocked on the building manager's office. An older woman with thick glasses and a stack of Sudoku puzzles looked up lazily. "Hey," Ethan began, "about apartment 4B who lived there before. Anyone recently?" She furrowed her brow. "4B?" She pulled a thick ledger from her drawer, flipping pages that smelled of dust and mildew. After a long moment, she looked up again. "There's number 4B, she said casually. Ethan froze. "What do you mean?" "It's across from 4A Leo's apartment." She frowned. "Honey, Leo lives in 4B, always has." The words knocked the air out of Ethan's lungs. He turned and ran back upstairs. He stood before the door where Leo lived. The number on the door now read 4B, not 4AN, across the hall. No door. Just wallpaper, no knob, no seam. Like it had never been there. He stumbled inside, breath shallow, thoughts spiraling. Leo was sitting on the couch, headphones on, watching static flash across the screen. Not a movie, not a game, just static. His head turned slowly. "You all right?" he asked again, that same voice, polished, perfect, dead. Ethan nodded numbly, stepped back outside, and walked across the hall. He ran his hands over the wall where the other door had been. Nothing, just drywall, seamless. But as he pressed his palm to it, he felt a warmth. Not from the building, from something behind it. A pulse, slow, alive. Like a machine trying to dream. That night he couldn't sleep. When he finally did, his dream placed him not in a house or school, but inside apartment 4B, or what it had once been. The walls pulsed like lungs. The ceiling was a night sky, swirling with fractured stars. In the center of the floor was a shallow indentation, a circle etched into steel, faintly glowing, a transfer site. A place where something or someone had been removed, and something else placed in. He woke drenched in sweat. Leo knocked on the door. "I made coffee," he said through the wood. But Ethan didn't answer. Because in the silence between them, he realized something devastating. He hadn't lost his best friend to violence, or time or death. He had lost him to replacement. Quietly, precisely, without permission. And without a trace. And if it happened to Leo, how many others had already been taken? After everything he had seen in apartment 4B, the flickering not Leo, the memory that no longer matched the map, the cold residue of something neither machine nor organic, Ethan did the only thing he knew how to do. He ran. Not from fear exactly, but from the sickening suspicion that reality itself was beginning to soften at the edges. He needed a pause, a place without glowing doors or whispering walls. And so for a while, he left the city. His aunt owned a small house deep in the countryside, where the trees grew wild and phone signals disappeared before sunset. It was meant to be a sanctuary. Instead, it became something else entirely. The village was small, the kind of place where every resident had lived there longer than memory itself. There were no neon signs or sirens here, only the rustle of leaves, the creaking of floorboards, and the occasional hum of wind between broken shutters. Ethan arrived just before the Perseid meteor shower, when the skies grew clear and restless with celestial traffic. Every night for the first week, he lay under the open stars, trying to forget the echo of Leo's too-perfect voice or the missing scar on his hand. But it wasn't the sky that disturbed him. It was the man who lived at the edge of the village, Mr. Harrow. To the villagers, he was just another local oddity, a relic from older times. He rarely spoke, never shopped, and only emerged from his crumbling stone cottage during meteor showers. He would walk to the highest hill at the forest's edge, stand completely still for hours, eyes fixed skyward, arms always folded behind his back, like a soldier waiting for orders that never came. Ethan first saw him from a distance, a silhouette on the ridge, haloed by starlight. Something about the way he stood, so motionless, so composed, sent a ripple down Ethan's spine. It wasn't reverence, it wasn't wonder, it was communication. Silent, deliberate, two-way. On the fourth night, Ethan followed him. He waited until the villagers had turned in, until the only sounds were cicadas and his own heartbeat. Then he trailed Mr. Harrow's slow ascent into the woods. The man didn't look back once. He moved like he had walked that path for centuries, never misstepping, never hesitating. Ethan kept his distance, weaving through pine and shadow, until the trees opened into a small clearing. There, in the center of the glade, was something Ethan hadn't expected. A stone altar, weathered, moss-covered, older than any building in the village, embedded with an object that didn't belong to any earthly age. It was sleek, metallic, and hummed with a deep, soft frequency. Not loud, but tangible, like a vibration felt in the ribs. Mr. Harrow placed both hands on the device, and a vertical beam of pale blue light extended from its surface, stretching into the night sky like a whisper between worlds. He didn't say a word. But then, as if sensing Ethan's presence from behind the trees, he spoke, not turning, not flinching, just speaking into the air around him. "They're listening," he said, his voice dry as leaves. "But they won't wait forever." Ethan stepped forward cautiously, heart hammering. "Who's listening?" Mr. Harrow turned slowly. For the first time, Ethan saw his face clearly, eyes clouded not by age, but by something behind them, like glass fog from within. Not who, what. There are no names where they come from. Just frequency and purpose. The light from the device grew stronger, shimmering like water under moonlight. "I've been their bridge," Harrow said, his voice growing softer. "Each of us chosen long ago. We were the first, back when Earth still thought the stars were quiet. But they never were. You don't hear them, boy, not because they're silent, but because we were taught not to listen." And then, without further word, he turned back toward the beam, his figure dissolving into its light like mist at dawn. The beam vanished. So did he. Ethan blinked. The forest stood still again. The device was gone. No trace, no stone, no clearing. Just moss and silence. When he returned to the village, no one remembered Mr. Harrow. Not his name, not his home, not the old house at the edge of the trees. Ethan hiked back to where the cottage should have stood, but found only a collapsed foundation, vines and roots reclaiming stone. As if the man, and everything he carried, had been extracted from the world like a corrupted file erased from history. That night, Ethan tried to sleep, but his body betrayed him. He woke at 3:13 a.m., trembling, drenched in sweat. There was a sound, deep and steady, like a drum in the earth. No, not a sound. A pulse. It throbbed at the base of his skull. Not painful, but insistent, like a code tapping on locked doors within his consciousness. He stumbled to the mirror and looked at himself. For the first time, he noticed something wrong in his reflection. Not his face, that was still his, but the eyes. They no longer flickered with confusion or fear. They looked alert, focused, as if a part of him knew exactly what was happening and had been waiting for the rest to catch up. He heard it again, louder now. The pulse, dumb, not random, rhythmic, timed, not a symptom. A signal, and deep inside, Ethan finally understood something terrifying and absolute. The replacements had not only begun, they were coordinated. They were timed, they were listening, and somehow, so was he. Ethan didn't speak about the man in the woods again. He told himself he had imagined the beam, the altar, the voice that spoke not to his ears, but to the rhythm of his blood. Yet, as he returned to the city, quieter now, heavier, he realized something had shifted, not just in him, but around him. People walked like rehearsed actors. Faces repeated in crowds. He kept catching the same man with the green scarf at different street corners, always pretending not to notice him. And the pulse, that quiet, persistent beat behind his thoughts. It never stopped. It was faint, but it was always there, like a lighthouse hidden behind fog. After a week of silence, Ethan's parents, unaware of anything beyond the ordinary, suggested he transfer schools. A fresh start, they said. Somewhere calmer. Somewhere less intense. He didn't argue. He knew the truth wouldn't fit into dinner conversations and therapist files. The new school was smaller, perched on the edge of an old mining town surrounded by cold, sloping hills. On his first day, the sky looked metallic. The wind was unnaturally still. Students shuffled past him, eyes glassy, laughter forced. He had barely stepped inside before he saw her. She sat by the window in homeroom, alone, still, watching the clouds like they held secret instructions. Her name, the teacher said, was Laya. She didn't turn when Ethan entered, but somehow he felt like she already knew he'd come. It wasn't just that she was quiet. It was something deeper, something dissonant, like a frequency he could feel but not hear. No one else seemed to pay her any attention. When Ethan asked a classmate about her during lunch, they frowned and said, "Who?" The next day, he took a photo of the class for a project. Everyone appeared in the image, except her. Where she had been sitting, there was only light. Not absence, but interference. Like her presence had been redacted by something beyond camera settings or digital filters. He checked the lens, took another picture, the same result. Leah wasn't just invisible to photographs, she rejected them. That afternoon, he approached her in the library where she sat alone, not reading but staring into a blank notebook, pen unmoving. He hesitated, then asked, "Why don't you show up in pictures?" She didn't smile, but there was a softness to her voice, as if she had been waiting a long time to be asked that exact question. "Because I wasn't made to be remembered the way others are," she said. "Not through mirrors, not through machines." He blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," she whispered, closing the notebook, "that I'm not entirely from here, and neither are you." Ethan froze. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied badly. But she only tilted her head. "Yes, you do. You've seen the man in the woods, felt the pulse, heard the rhythm. You're waking up. How do you know that?" Leah leaned forward, voice barely audible. "Because I'm ahead of you, not better, just earlier." She told him she was born in a facility near the Arctic Circle, no birth certificate, no recorded parents. Raised by silence and synthetic light. Her earliest memory was not a face, but a vibration, a language of frequency and shape. She was part of a program that was never publicly acknowledged, funded by channels that no longer existed. She was a blend, human, and something more, not alien exactly, but aligned to them, the ones who watch, the ones who seed. "There are others like me," she said. "Scattered, hidden, most don't know what they are until they're triggered." "What kind of trigger?" Ethan asked. She reached across the table and touched his hand. In that moment, something shattered inside his vision. Not pain, not fear, just clarity. They were no longer in the library. They stood together in a boundless space of dark violet and shifting silver. A map, but not of land or oceans. It was Earth, yes, but seen from another layer, covered in networks of glowing white grids. Every major city pulsed softly in unison, like the planet itself was breathing. Lines of light flowed beneath oceans, branched into forests, climbed mountain spines. It was beautiful, horrifying, and impossibly alive. "These are the frequency channels," she said. "Not radio, not sound, life pulses." Patterned resonance across human clusters. The integration is not coming. It's already begun. What are they doing? Ethan asked, barely breathing. They're sensing us, Leah said, not replacing everyone. Just enough. Enough to shift the pattern, to rewrite the instinct, not the flesh. Ethan looked around. Some pulses flickered rapidly, some were stable. But others, entire cities, had gone dim. Those are the ones that refused, she said, answering his thought. You see why they needed us? We're bridges, he said. We're keys, she corrected. Without resistance, there's no balance. But without alignment, there's no survival. They didn't invade, they asked. And too many said yes before they knew what they were saying yes to. Back in the library, Ethan gasped. His hand was still in hers. The air smelled like ozone. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Because you're nearing your point of fracture, she said. And when that happens, you'll either collapse or open. To what? To purpose. The bell rang. Students shuffled out. Leah stood. The others will come for you soon, she said softly. Not to harm, to guide. What you do with that is still your choice. But make no mistake, Ethan. Your signal has already gone active. And just like that, she walked away. He tried to follow, but the hall was already full, and she had disappeared again, not into a shadow, not into a crowd, but as if the world had folded slightly and left her behind. That night, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the pulse to begin again. But it didn't. Instead, the silence grew. Purposeful, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide what kind of being he was going to become. There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than sound, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening beneath the surface, too quiet to scream, too deep to run from. Ethan had always trusted his senses, his instincts, his ability to tell when something was off. But now, after Leah's disappearance, no, her withdrawal, and the vision they shared of Earth wrapped in networks of pulsating light, he found himself questioning everything, not just the world around him, but the very parameters of what counted as real, as measurable, as human. He spent the next week in isolation, unable to return to his old school, unwilling to go back to the apartment he once called home. Instead, he moved through the city like a shadow wearing a human skin, watching, listening, observing what no one else seemed to see. There were patterns everywhere, in subway announcements, in the blinking of streetlights, in the quiet synchronization of human movement during rush hour. But it wasn't until he stumbled upon the anomaly at precisely 4:32 and May the 17th of the month that the pieces began to align. It started with a power grid fluctuation he noticed on a conspiracy forum, a user claiming that a short, unexplained power surge was recorded in over 60 cities across the globe, all at the exact same minute. The thread was buried within hours, the user account deleted, but Ethan managed to retrieve a cached version. That same night, driven by something between desperation and instinct, he stayed awake with a frequency recorder he borrowed from an old college tech lab. At exactly 4:32 am, his screen lit up, not with sound, but with a wave, low and massive, too deep for ears to detect but unmistakable in its structure. It wasn't static, it was language, patterned, deliberate, and pulsing with intent. The signal protocol, he would later call it. Digging deeper, Ethan began tracing similar patterns in reports scattered across academic publications, declassified research, even unexplained anomalies in weather stations and wildlife behavior. The same timestamp appeared again and again, 4:32 UTC on the 17th, every month. Always the same cities. Always near dense population clusters, schools, hospitals, transit hubs, large apartment complexes. Not random, not accidental. A networked pulse woven directly into the infrastructure of modern life, hidden in plain sight, like a ghost embedded in the circuitry of civilization. He visited one of the pulse epicenters, an abandoned research facility on the outskirts of town, officially shuttered for structural instability, but still quietly powered. The building hummed beneath his feet. Inside, he found nothing but dust, shattered glass, and one remaining server, inactive, until he connected it to a portable energy source. Then, the interface came alive. And the files, they were not meant for public eyes. Encrypted logs detailed a project called Eco-7, once under the Department of Neuroacoustics, later absorbed into a private multinational that no longer existed, or had renamed itself so many times its origin was untraceable. The reports were chilling in their precision. The signal, it said, was not meant to control thought. That would be primitive. It was meant to modulate frequency pathways within the brain, not to suppress emotion, but to reorient perception, gradually, subtly, until the host no longer recognized the difference between their own thoughts and the ones introduced through harmonic embedding. In layman's terms, the signal didn't tell people what to do. It taught them how to think differently, how to redefine what it meant to feel, to trust, to belong. After prolonged exposure, subjects became increasingly harmonic, a term used in the reports to describe individuals whose neural resonance aligned perfectly with the programmed frequency. They smiled more, slept better, became less anxious, less individual, more compliant. The most terrifying part, it worked. A line in one of the final reports chilled him more than any alien warning or dream ever had. After 18 months of protocol exposure, 71% of test subjects self-identified as no longer fully human, without prompt, suggestion, or fear. They welcomed the shift. They named it evolution, but something had gone wrong. The project's lead researcher, Dr. Mara Avail, noted unexpected divergences, clusters of humans who rejected the signal subconsciously, whose brains interpreted the harmonic frequency as an invasion. These individuals began showing side effects: memory distortion, time loss, even hallucinations of alternate realities. The reports labeled them fractured anchors, dangerous, not because they were unstable, but because they remained fully human, fully resistant, and could infect others with their refusal. Ethan closed the file. His hands were shaking. He wasn't just one of them. He was an anchor. And so was Leah. There was one final log, timestamped just weeks before the facility had gone dark. The signal has reached full deployment. Global coverage achieved. Resistance clusters remain, but are shrinking. Evolution is not a possibility. It is the baseline now. He backed away from the console as if it might explode. Because if this was true, then humanity was no longer the dominant species on Earth. Not because it had been overthrown, but because it had been rewritten. Not by force, but by design. And most terrifying of all, the world had accepted it. Not through surrender, but through relief. The signal had made people feel better. It had soothed the madness, quieted the wars, leveled the chaos. Who would resist such peace? Only those who remembered pain as part of freedom. Ethan stepped out of the building into the cold dawn, but the world no longer felt solid beneath him. Everything was vibrating, subtly, deeply, constantly. Trees, clouds, the bones in his body. He understood now why Leah had said he was nearing fracture. Why the man in the woods had told him they wouldn't wait forever. Why the janitor who never aged had warned him that curiosity could save or erase, because he was no longer an observer. He was the variable. The next signal pulse would come in 9 days. He had 9 days left to decide who he was and who he would remain before the next layer of awakening began. And this time, it would not be optional. Some truths don't scream. They whisper, through chromosomes, through blood, through the ancient instructions folded into every cell. After Ethan uncovered the subsonic pulse protocol and realized that millions were being silently reshaped, not by force, but by resonance, he couldn't return to his old life, not even in pretense. His reflection felt false, his heartbeat foreign. And every familiar street now hummed with an invisible frequency he could no longer unhear. But instinct told him that the pulse wasn't the beginning. It was only the conductor of a transformation already embedded in the flesh. He knew where he had to go. There was a biotech firm across the city, one of those sleek, ultra-modern labs built on a grant from nowhere, funded by no government, registered under a name that didn't appear in any database before 2022. It was called Virion Systems, and it had recently purchased the rights to thousands of neonatal gene studies, including some Ethan remembered from his high school biology lectures, studies that were supposed to have been decommissioned after widespread ethical outcry. That night, under cover of an acid-gray sky and a silence that felt intentional, Infin met Leah in the shadows outside the facility's back entrance. Her eyes, always strange, always luminous, looked heavier now, as if the more she remembered about herself, the more her human mask struggled to contain the weight of it. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Inside the lab, they moved with precision. Leah bypassed retinal scanners as if she had been expected. Ethan decoded a firewall by feeding it a strand of his own blood. And to his horror, the system accepted it. Within moments, they stood before a glass-encased server core, pulsing softly with an internal heartbeat. And within that server, the world's most protected genome database, the files had no names. Just long numerical sequences, each one tagged with anomalies, timestamps, and evolution markers. But buried within the logs was a keyword Leah had programmed the system to recognize: Anomaly B7, cross-epochic genome integration. And then, everything unraveled. Millions of entries, flagged, not in one country, not in one race. Across the planet, quiet, widespread genetic deviations appearing since 2003, with an exponential spike starting in 2016. They weren't mutations. They were insertions, clean, surgical, and utterly inhuman. Sequences that resembled no known virus, no ancient DNA, no evolutionary accident. These weren't evolutionary leftovers. They were instructions. They were blueprints. The affected subjects, ordinary people, parents, children, even newborns, had one thing in common: a neurological trait unobserved in natural human development. Ethan read the reports aloud, voice trembling, heart racing. Subjects exhibit synchronous emotional regulation, elevated spatial temporal processing, and hybrid limbic suppression. In other words, they didn't feel the same way anymore. Their emotional centers had been softened, regulated, sometimes erased. Their empathy increased, but their individuality decreased. They could think clearer, faster, but they no longer questioned why they thought at all. The data grew darker. Birth rates had dropped dramatically. But what had gone unnoticed was that among the declining birth rate, a new class of infant had emerged: Type L cohorts. Children who smiled within hours of birth. Children whose brain scans lit up in harmonic symmetry with frequencies like the one Ethan had recorded at 4:32. They didn't cry like other babies. They didn't dream like other babies. They were already attuned. Ethan backed away from the console. The weight of it hit him all at once. This wasn't a future possibility. This wasn't some alien threat waiting to descend from orbit. It had already happened. The human genome was no longer purely human. Earth was no longer purely Earth. And Leah, she was already part of the new architecture. She didn't deny it. Not anymore. She told him how she was born, not in a hospital, but in a compound buried beneath an unmarked mountain. Not raised but observed, trained, encouraged to blend, to simulate affection, to mirror fear, until one day it stopped being performance. Until she could feel what humans felt, but never the same way. She told him that she was the third in her line, the third Leah, each version more emotionally precise than the last. And Ethan realized, in a sick twist of irony, that his own blood had let them into the server, that he too carried those markers. That he was not discovering the truth. He was confirming it. He remembered the visions, the grid of light covering Earth, the pulses sensing minds, the warm feeling of belonging without struggle. And he finally understood. This wasn't war. It was absorption. Not all at once, but gradually, patiently. A better species wasn't invading. It was building itself from within the ruins of the old one. And humans were helping. They were calling it progress. Wellness, mental clarity, enhanced empathy, universal harmony. But what was being lost in return? Questioning, rebellion, art, wildness, madness, love that didn't make sense, grief that never healed. All the things that made being human feel unbearable and yet divine. Why me? Ethan whispered, not to Leah, but to whatever presence had designed this blueprint. She looked at him, her voice almost breaking. Because you're still fractured enough to choose. Then, from the deepest archive in the server, a final log surfaced. Undated. No author. Just 3 words. Integration. 91% complete. Ethan's body went cold. Not because he feared what came next, but because he realized what it meant. Humanity wasn't losing a battle. It had already surrendered, and celebrated the surrender. The last 9%, they weren't survivors. They were anomalies. And Ethan was one of them. The server began to flicker. Their time was up. But the choice was still in front of him. Run, hide, or evolve. And outside the lab, in the cold neon light of the future, the pulse began again. The night the sky folded was the night humanity's illusion of ownership ended. There were no warnings, no blaring sirens, no alien armadas streaking through the clouds. Just silence, followed by an absence we didn't have words for. The stars didn't disappear, they simply rearranged. One by one, constellations warped like watercolors left out in the rain, and in their place, something emerged. Not a ship, not a satellite, but a living construct, suspended in orbit, breathing in wavelengths. Not built, not engineered. Grown. Ethan felt it before he saw it. A subtle pressure in the bones, a resonance behind the teeth, like the entire planet had shifted key. Leah called it the threshold. And now it had arrived. Within hours, the world changed. Power grids collapsed, not all at once, but sequentially, as if something were tracing the arteries of civilization and pinching them shut. Cities didn't explode. They dimmed. Air traffic fell from the sky, not in flames, but in eerie silence. Communications faded into static, not chaotic noise, but structured hums, like lullabies for a different species. People began to fall into deep, inexplicable sleep. Not death. Not illness, just disconnection. They called it the sleeping. News anchors whispered theories before disappearing mid-broadcast. Hospitals filled with unresponsive bodies, their vitals steady, their minds unreachable. Those who remained awake watched with frozen breath as loved ones slipped away, not violently, but gracefully, as if they had merely remembered a different dream and chosen to return to it. Ethan and Leah were still awake, for now. They stood on a rooftop overlooking a blackened city, lit only by the quiet shimmer of the threshold hanging above like a second moon. Leah stared at it not with awe, but recognition. And Ethan, still reeling from the discovery of the genome database, couldn't ignore the truth any longer. This wasn't a signal calling aliens to Earth. It was a signal waking them up. The hybrids weren't sleeper agents. They were seeds. And the threshold was their sun. Leah finally spoke, voice trembling not with fear, but with purpose. It's begun, the alignment phase. The signal's full waveform has activated. The culling is happening now. Ethan demanded answers, but she only offered clarity. The pulse wasn't just a communication tool. It was a filter. A resonance test designed to scan every nervous system on the planet, detect incompatibility with the new design, and disconnect it. Not out of cruelty. Not even as punishment, but necessity. The new architecture needed coherence. Dissonance was discarded. And the unaligned, those still fully human. Those whose biology resisted the hybrid code were being removed from the system, not by violence, by silence, by sleep. The sleepers wouldn't die. But they'd never wake up either. Ethan staggered back. How many? He demanded to know. Leah closed her eyes, face full of sorrow. By sunrise. Nearly 80%. That number crushed his lungs. And then she said the unthinkable. I have to go. She wasn't leaving him. She was being summoned. Her pulse was synchronizing, her cells aligning. She had always known this moment would come. Her purpose was not survival. It was completion. I'm a bridge, Ethan. That's what I was made for. He tried to hold her hand. For a moment, he could feel her warmth, her skin, everything that made her seem real, human, alive. And then, it was like holding static. She stepped back, and for the first time since they met, her eyes reflected no light, only depth. As if he were staring into something vaster than sky. You can still choose, she said. But the window is closing. And then she was gone, not in a flash of light, not in some dramatic beam, but simply phased out, like she had never truly been in one place at all. Ethan collapsed to his knees. He screamed, but the city did not answer. Far below, people wandered the streets, dazed. Some dropped to the ground mid-step. Others stared up at the threshold with blank, waiting eyes. The pulse grew stronger. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a presence, inside teeth, inside veins, inside memory. Ethan ran. He ran through empty streets, past cars stalled in intersections, past televisions flickering with shapes instead of words. He ran until the edge of the city blurred into rural dark, until the stars were clear again, except they weren't stars anymore. They were patterns. He reached a field, one he knew from childhood, where he had once stared at the night sky and wondered if anyone was out there. Now he knew. They were never out there. They had always been here. A device lay waiting, not buried. Not hidden, placed. It pulsed faintly. A handheld crystal node, glowing with the same hue as Lia's eyes. It hummed when he approached, not aggressively. Almost welcoming. A message appeared, projected in the air. Elegant and wordless, but he understood it. You are a fracture. You may integrate or isolate. He hesitated. What did isolation mean? Survival? Resistance? Or simply erasure? The message changed. Humanity will continue, but what you define as human will not. He realized there was no invasion, no war, no conquest, only refinement. Humanity was being invited to transcend itself, but not on its own terms. And he had one day, one last sunset to decide. Integrate, and lose the chaos, the pain, the beauty of being fractured. Or isolate, and preserve what made humanity human, even if it meant watching the world evolve without him. The threshold pulsed once more. And in the silence of that final night, Ethan faced a truth far colder than death. Survival was not the goal. Alignment was. When Ethan opened his eyes, the world was no longer whole. The stars above blinked in and out, not like distant suns, but like thoughts hesitating between decisions. The grass beneath his feet shimmered, as if unsure whether it was real or a memory. The air crackled not with electricity, but with potential. The threshold still hung in the sky, a living lattice pulsing in frequencies no human ear could hear. But now, the very fabric of reality around him seemed tired, stretched thin, as if the weight of too many versions of the truth was dragging it apart. At first, he thought it was trauma. Maybe Leah's disappearance, the revelation of the culling, the choice he hadn't yet. Maybe it had broken something inside his mind. But then he saw the cracks. Not metaphorical, not emotional. Literal fractures in the air, thin glowing lines like heat mirages, where the world split open for a fraction of a second and showed something else on the other side. A classroom he'd never attended. A battlefield where cities burned with blue fire. A mirror version of himself screaming as if he were on fire, though his skin was untouched. And then it happened again. He blinked, and he was elsewhere. Not far. Just different. The same field, the same sky, but a tree was missing. The air smelled like ash. And behind him stood someone, not someone, himself. Older, hardened, wearing a coat that looked scavenged from a future that had forgotten beauty. This other Ethan stared at him with exhausted eyes, not surprised, not afraid. Just prepared. "You made it here too," the older version said softly, as if they'd rehearsed this moment in 1,000 forgotten dreams. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry with questions he couldn't name. The older Ethan looked past him, scanning the skies. "The convergence point is breaking down. We don't have long." And just like that, the field shifted again, this time violently. The sky blinked twice, once red, once green. Buildings rose and fell like breathing things. Shadows froze in place, as if time itself had forgotten how to move forward. They were inside a memory that didn't belong to either of them. Ethan stumbled. What is this?" The older one sighed. "Not what, when, and where. Every version of Earth that resisted is now collapsing into each other. They're not replacing humanity on just one Earth. They're doing it everywhere." That word, everywhere, hit like a thunderclap across Ethan's soul. This wasn't just an invasion of a planet. It was a pruning of realities. A cosmic filtration system, cleaning out the universes where resistance was too strong, choices too divergent, chaos too persistent. He remembered Leah's words, "The integration has already begun." But he had misunderstood the scope. Integration wasn't limited to species. It was targeting entire versions of existence. Ethan felt it in his chest now, a rhythmic pull, like gravity but stranger. Not a force dragging him down, but dragging him inward, toward something. The field, the core, whatever lay at the center of all this. The older Ethan continued, his voice now shaking. "I stayed. I resisted. I fought. I watched everyone I loved either disappear into sleep or become something else. The cities collapsed, not from war, but from forgetting themselves. I am the last version of you who chose isolation." He pulled out a thin metal shard, a fragment from a hybrid transmission tower, pulsing faintly. "This is your key, the beacon. Every Ethan that makes it this far is given a choice. Some join, some destroy, some vanish entirely, unable to decide. But the convergence doesn't wait. It collapses the undecided." And suddenly, Ethan understood. This was not a battle for Earth. It was a test of coherence. Which versions of reality were compatible with the new structure being born? Those that weren't were being folded inward, memory by memory, until they ceased to exist. Lightning danced across the sky, but not natural lightning. It formed symbols, glyphs, strings of meaning only half understood. The trees swayed to music that wasn't playing. He saw children running through the fields, flickering in and out of phase. Some of them were him, some were not. The older Ethan pressed the shard into his hand. "You won't have this conversation again. Every Ethan who reaches the final threshold only speaks to himself once. After this we diverge." And then he was gone. No portal, no beam of light. Just a ripple, as if his presence had never quite belonged here in the first place. Ethan stood alone again, but he could feel the fragments around him. Echoes of his other selves, lives unlived, decisions not taken. A universe cluttered with what-ifs and maybes, all converging now into a singular moment of truth. He knew where to go. He walked through the warped fields, watching the landscape shift around him. An office tower rising from the dirt, flickering into a lighthouse, then a ruin. People passed him with half faces and mirrored eyes, whispering thoughts he hadn't yet thought himself. Time unraveled. Space rewrote itself. And still he walked. At the edge of the convergence, where all versions of him bled together like ink in water, a door awaited. Not a technological marvel, Just a door. Wooden, simple, weathered. And above it, carved in a language that wasn't human, but felt like it had always been part of him, was one word. Threshold. He placed his hand on the handle, and for a heartbeat, all the voices stopped. All timelines aligned. Every fragment of Ethan, the hopeful, the angry, the broken, the brave, merged into one breath. He opened the door and stepped through. The world had begun to split at the seams, not in chaos, but in quiet unraveling. People walked through streets layered with moments that no longer aligned, flickering images of buildings from one timeline bleeding into the next. Conversations echoed from mouths that hadn't yet spoken. Time was no longer a road but a spiral, looping back on itself, collapsing inward. And Ethan stood at the eye of it all, holding a choice neither fully his nor entirely avoidable. When the core opened, that impossibly vast space between thought and matter, Ethan wasn't walking on ground. He was walking through memory, through collective will, through something deeper than language. A place not built by hands, but by intention. Light hovered like liquid above his head, cycling patterns he didn't recognize, but instinctively understood. Every sound was a question. Every pulse was a whisper from a version of himself that never got this far. And then came the voices not of warning, but of invitation. From every dimension where Ethan had ever existed, or almost existed, came echoes of what had been and what could be. 1,000 choices, 1,000 outcomes. Some Ethans had burned it all to protect a crumbling human legacy. Some had submitted out of fear, becoming shells. Most had never made it here at all. But this Ethan, this one had learned, had seen, had loved, had changed. And waiting at the center of that core was Leah, no longer just the girl who couldn't be photographed, but the bridge between beginnings and ends. She didn't speak, because speech was too small now. Instead, her presence poured through him like warmth through bone, like music remembered in a language never learned. He asked her, not in words, but in feeling, what becomes of us if we leave what we are? She answered, you never were only what you thought you were. Around them, Earth was still pulsing with the signal, the network humming across continents, synchronizing thought, filtering resistance, preparing for rebirth. Ethan could stop it. There was still time. All he had to do was fracture the field, collapse the pulse, shatter the convergence. But then, what would remain? A dying species clinging to memories of war, isolation, and fear? Or something new, not fully human, not fully alien, but something more? The question was never about survival. It was about becoming. Ethan looked to the stars, and for a moment, they blinked back, so he stepped into the beam. There was no explosion, no flash, no scream. Just a soft unraveling, like silk threads pulled through time. His skin shimmered, his eyes widened, and then there was light, not around him, but within. Across the planet, the grids synchronized. Cities went silent. The ocean stilled. And in every mind tuned to the new frequency, a message bloomed. We are no longer separate. Fear dissolved. Not all at once, but wave by wave. Resistance gave way to understanding. The new Earth didn't rise with thunder, but with resonance. A calm unity humming in every tree, every streetlight, every cell. Somewhere, in the places where dreams begin, children would one day learn not about countries or bloodlines, but about echoes and convergence. Their histories would not begin with war, but with the moment Ethan chose not to resist, but to evolve. And in a sky no longer empty, the stars blinked again, in unison this time. Leah was still there, not beside him, but in him, as the piece that remembered what it meant to hope. This was not extinction. This was not defeat. This was the first song of something greater.